الأوراق المعدة في
of Qatar. So there are papers that are going to be presented in this session. They're going to talk about the experience and the case of the state of Qatar between 2017 till date. So it is going to talk about the experience of the state of Qatar during the blockade that was imposed on it. We have with us in this session Dr. Farid Elsahn. He's going to talk about economic diversification, a sustainable development approach. We have with us Dr. Frank Himpel, who is going to talk about the successful creation of resilient supply chains, which creates potentials for further successful economic diversification. And we have Ayhab Saad, who is going to talk about the effect of the blockade on trade and export diversification in Qatar. So we would like to give the floor to Dr. Farid Elsahn, who is going to be with us. He is from the Doha Institute for Higher Studies. So he's got between 15 to 20 minutes. We're going to be strict with regard to the time allocated to each and every speaker because we need to end the conference on time. Dr. Farid, go ahead, sir.
Can the speaker use the microphone, please? Assalamu alaikum, and thank you, Dr. Mohammad. This paper will be dealing with economic diversification, a sustainable development approach, Qatar as a case study. The papers so far, the last 2 days, have left us little room to speak in detail about the strategies of economic diversification. I, on my part, will focus on the management side and the Qatar strategies in this regard. Maybe a quick introduction than the reality of economic diversification in the Arab countries. Then we will focus on the Qatar national strategy for economic diversification and the pillars upon which this strategy is built. Then at the end, I will come up with some conclusions as to what kind of economic diversification strategy we can build to achieve a sustainable development. Different countries and different organizations are facing formidable challenges now, and these are linked to the changes happening at the global level and also at the international, regional and local level. We see a lot of complicated and interactive changes which have a negative impact on the economies of these countries, especially when it comes to smaller countries which rely on natural resources as a source and revenue for their economy. So therefore these countries need to adopt a clear strategy and create the kind of restructuring in their economies to achieve that. Historically, there have been different choices for countries. Some countries like the Gulf countries used to rely on foreign investments and their assets abroad. They tried to optimize their portfolio of investments to utilize that and invest it in the sovereign funds to achieve better living standards for their citizens. Some countries talked about experts All these choices are there and available, but they are dismissing the big picture. Today, in order to achieve economic diversification, we must find an operational definition for economic diversification, which is a developmental issue, relies on changing structurally the economy, which relies basically on the basics of production and export in different sectors. And as we will see in a minute, when it comes to productivity and production, these are the cornerstones in any economy and in development. You can diversify the sources of financing and the income sources for the state, but raising the productivity level for the goods and services remain the cornerstone for economic development. Also, part and parcel of the definitions is the avoidance of relying on one source for the country's revenues, and also economic diversification is also very important to raising the capabilities of productivity in the goods and services sectors, because this can lead to strengthen the position of institutions when it comes to international competitiveness. We talk about competitive advantages, and in the past we used to focus on one side. Now we say you may have the resources, but you cannot utilize them in a way that achieves competitive advantages to you. So therefore, we must focus on the excellence of what we do. It is more important than diversification, because we may diversify but with less efficiency. If we look back at the situation and the prevalent conditions in Arab countries, unfortunately, Arab countries became independent in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. The Gulf countries got their independence in the 70s. The basic issues faced these countries was how to achieve sustainable development at all levels, level of the economy and level of social life and the environment, etc. Unfortunately, this has not happened, and this is basically due to the lack of a political will. In some countries, they used to pay lip service to these things. They used to talk a lot about it, but unfortunately, without much tangible steps when it comes to public policies, not only as regards the economic diversification, but also when it comes to corruption and mismanagement, etc., and other aspects of life. These countries have not managed to place themselves on the map of economic diversification at the world level. In the 80s, some countries, after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the accompanying changes at the end of the 80s, and with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund and others, and the role they played, made some countries give a bigger role to the private sector. But unfortunately, when it comes to practical application of these steps, the impact was not that positive. As for the reality of economic diversification in the Arab countries, of late, many countries started focusing on that and on national visions 20, 30, and 40. Regardless of all that, ultimately there was always emphasis on the importance of economic diversification and giving a bigger role to the private sector. As I said at the beginning of this talk, that there are three levels, and I'll try and allude to them as much as I can. Unfortunately, at the level of statistics and indicators, we will see in a minute that high levels have not been achieved. It's important with the expansion of the basis of production, there should be some complementary policies which should help the country move in the horizontal or vertical directions, either through the supply chains or to invest in the agriculture industry, oil and gas or services, or horizontally. But what is more important from a strategic point of view is all of this should be value adding. Without that, we will not achieve any improvement of the GDP. As we said, it's incumbent upon countries to take into consideration foreign direct investment, local investment, openness to the outside world and others, but each country has to make up its own mind about the best strategic choices which are compatible to the size of its population, to its resources, its location, etc., and other strategic considerations which can enable the country to compete with other countries. Regrettably, if we look at the economic performance, if we look at the state of Qatar, by and large, there is some weakness, whether at the level of agriculture, services, exports, the industry, unfortunately, for different reasons. For example, the weakness in the performance of the agricultural sector can be due to many reasons, like the scarcity of water resources in some country, the urban expansion at the expense of agricultural land, the climatic conditions, many other reasons. The experts also, there is a focus on certain products, like the Gulf countries, for example, focus on the oil and gas sector. Some other countries can focus on the agricultural goods. What's important about exports is to the expansion of the number of products which are exported and the increase in the markets we export to. For example, some countries have a limited number of customers and this limits their options. So far as services are concerned, there are services. There are services when it comes to hospitality and tourism. But when we speak about services, we mean the services which are reliant on high technology. This is a problematic area in the Arab countries, and with the fourth industrial revolution, which leads to so many problems. So for the lack of time, we should move straight into the Qatari strategy for economic diversification. In fact, these efforts have started early in the state of Qatar with the Qatar National Vision 2030, which was, I think, decided in 2008, and it is aimed at turning Qatar into an advanced country by 2030. and also the living standards of the future generations should be improved. The 2011 to 2016 was the first national strategy in Qatar for economic diversification, and in fact there were emphasis laid on the fact that we must focus on the participation of the non-carbohydrate sector, non-oil and gas, and push forward for more economic diversification. In fact, there has been some limited successes, although there have been failures too, like, for example, enhancing the efficiency of the market, guaranteeing the information security and privacy laws, and creating an environment conducive to investment. Um, the Qatar National Strategy 2018 to 2022 has an entire chapter devoted to economic diversification and the review of that, which focuses on two main pillars: productivity and competitiveness on one hand, and development and growth by focusing on the private sector. This is a very important point because I can't remember in English what they say. I think he's trying to say to be uh, jack of all trades, master of none. This is what the speaker was trying to say. So therefore, you must focus on the sectors that guarantee you the kind of competitiveness and excellence, like transformative industries, academia, the communications, etc., and logistical support services and tourism, etc. They all are very important. There are four important factors which can be talked about: the economic clusters, direct foreign direct investment, creativity and innovation, and the basis of all strategies, and that is providing the technology, the infrastructure, the technology, human capital. These are all very basic. Then international relations. There is a main conclusion for this strategy, which is hope to achieve an economy which is more competitive, more productive, and also should be compatible with the Qatar National Vision, which is based on four pillars in human, environmental, social, and educational. We are talking about a national economy which is competitive, which is productive, which is in a state of growth, and manages to live the standards of living. We reached six conclusions. First of all, a bigger participation for non-oil and gas sectors. The second, to enhance the levels of productivity, especially in the sectors of priority. Number three, to increase the volume of exports in the non-oil and gas sector, also to increase the participation of the private sector in the national economy, enhance a culture of innovation and the Qatari workforce, and finally to enhance the position of Qatar as a regional hub. Today, in order to have a national strategy which is suitable, this should be based on main or basic pillars. And my conclusion in this regard is, in order to have a economic diversification strategy which manages a sustainable development requires a clear political vision from the political leadership. Not only that, but I was happy to hear that the paper so far focused on the human capital, the academia, and the supply chains. All of this should be put together, coordinated, and dealt with as an integrated part, with the clear determination of the role of the private sector, because the private sector is supposed to lead development with the state as a regulator. And as what my colleague said in the previous session when he spoke about the DFI, also we must focus on the local investment, not the foreign investment only, because local investment in Egypt we had a huge problem that anybody who invested, whether Egyptian or non-Egyptian, used to wait 6 months before they get approvals. We want to deal with the situation like what they did in the Emirates and facilitate and expedite the opportunity, because this is a very important catalyst for any national economy. Also, to develop and improve the educational system to reach a knowledge-based economy based on innovation. Also to import and transfer technology fast and then develop it locally. Now we see countries like Israel and others are exporting technology, and they have become pioneers in that. Also to provide an industrial infrastructure and give a bigger role to SMEs, and also all of this will enable us to play a bigger role. Also development at the horizontal and vertical levels, and you think globally and act locally. This is what they say, and especially that the market in the GCC is very small, so therefore you must think globally, and if you want to do that you have to understand the needs of the market. Also to approach the international supply chains, and unfortunately nowadays the competition is not between countries or companies, it's between the chain as a whole or the network as a whole. You can produce somewhere, you can distribute somewhere else and consume somewhere else. So therefore you have to have a role in all of this if you want to compete. And finally, we must expand the basis of the markets, and also to have packages of government rules and regulations, legislations which can support the main players in the diversification effort. And finally, we must focus on human capital, technology, and information. In the past, we used to talk about the land and the resources and capital. Now we talk about new production tools which we must focus on, which will be the gateway to economic diversification. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا. Thank you very much. So the second paper is going to be presented by Dr. Frank Himpel, who is going to talk about the successful creation of resilient supply chains, which creates potentials for further successful economic diversification. Qatar as a case study. So would like to give the floor to Dr. Frank. Please go ahead. So هذا ما يحصل عندما يكون هناك ألماني يقدم عرض إلكترونية ل PDF ألماني.
Thank you. I appreciate. Thank you so much. Well, I'd like to thank, first of all, the organizers, the Arab Center, the Doha Institute, and also Konrad Adenauer Stiftung for having me here. I also like to thank all the participants in this wonderful workshop. Thank you for having me. I try to speak a little bit slower so as to accommodate for the translation, which I think they're doing a wonderful job. So thank you so much for the translation. And today I would like to talk about a topic that comes from a logistical perspective. I am a logistician, and I try to offer a humble view on how supply chain, logistics, and supply chain resilience does have some effect on the topic of this conference, namely economic diversification. Now, as we have seen throughout this fine conference, there are many facets to it and many factors to it. And I just try to offer a humble view, a humble contribution through the eyes of a logistician, to just complement some facets to it, so to offer this view to it. Now, as we said in the beginning, the onset was the diplomatic rift that occurred in 2017. And the situation in 2017, through the eyes of a logistician, as far as Qatar is concerned, that Qatar was required basically overnight to reassemble, to restructure their entire supply chain system. So looking at it through the eyes of a logistician, this was a very complex issue that basically needed to be resolved overnight, and it was not an easy task. So if we look at it through those eyes, we can basically narrow down some views that are pinpointing us in this direction. The first comment about this is Qatar went about this by trying to resolve this issue in a political and diplomatic way. And trying to resolve those issues in a diplomatic and political way by the nature of the approach takes time. So while from the political view, you need time to negotiate and political solutions to find them from a logistical point of view, you basically need to start and open up new partnerships basically overnight because you need to procure a country. You need to supply a country with needed products because the people at the end of the day, they need food, they need supplies. So looking at it through the eyes of a logistician, you needed new partnerships and you needed to reach out to different parts of the world, maybe where you have not been venturing out before, trying to allocate products for the country and for the people in the country. So this meant that it was needed to organize new routes, new relationships for inbound and outbound logistics. It meant to utilize the infrastructures that are there from like air and sea transportation. And it meant to decide which products probably to manufacture within Qatar, to build up production capacity, manufacturing capacity, and from which markets still to procure. So it was a make or import, make or buy decision. So it was kind of a complex array as a background. And due to the time, I will refrain from looking at various different products, but I will take one product as an example, which is, through the eyes of consumers, typically a very sensitive or critical product, namely milk and dairy or milk products. Why is that? We know through consumer behavior, consumer psychology research, that if customers don't find milk and milk products in their supermarkets, consumers will easily get nervous. And in order to avoid this, the supply, the resupply with milk and milk products was very critical. So if we look into milk, as an example, we see that the road transportation basically stopped overnight. And all the road-based imports of milk stopped overnight. So it was basically overnight that the air wing, air transportation, and the sea wing, sea transportation, had to cover the road transportation capacity that used to be before. And it is due to the air wing, the air transportation capacity, and due to the sea wing, sea transportation capacity, that Qatar was still able to supply this much needed product. And especially with regards to milk, the air transportation was very critical in terms of supplying the country. And also, if we not only look at the volumes that have been transported, but if we look as an example of how many countries we as logisticians needed to procure the country and supply the country with milk and milk products, we can see that up to the immediate effects of the blockade, we had more than 40 countries as origins or sources for milk and milk products. So from a logistician point of view, if you transport milk and milk-based products, which is in itself a little bit difficult because it's temperature-based, this became quite a task, yes? And there is quite some learnings that can be taken from it. So to summarize this at this point, the number of sourcing countries that were used as origins was significantly diversified. That was a quantitative aspect, but you also need to maintain the other products. And if we look on average, I just depicted it here, 1.8 times as much sourcing countries for other types of food at that time. If we stay at the example of milk, Qatar became self-efficient and is capable of exporting milk nowadays. So with regards to milk, the situation has shifted from importing to be able to export. Yes, this is the strategic capacity nowadays, and those superior logistics capabilities that have been built in Qatar are there, and they can be used for further purposes. If we just look into humanitarian logistics, if we look into COVID-19 recovery issues, so there might be other use cases from which to use these logistical capabilities. So if we try to build something like a typology, I'm not classifying, I'm just giving a typology, a humble typology to this, we have seen that based on the logistical experience gained through this exercise at that time, it is able to support overall diversification efforts. And we have just seen that we need targeted sectors so as to provide, from a logistical point of view, also the excellence that is required. And this basically transcends into something that has been developed by a National Products Competitiveness Support Department in the MOCI, or also as a Qatar quality mark to benchmark the performance and the suitability of Qatari products versus international products. Yes, so there is some development that can be seen as a result of the learnings from that blockade recovery or from the recovery of the diplomatic rift. If we go into other opportunities, and we touched base to a lot of opportunities that stem from diversification, we also see that Qatar now has about 900 factories, or even more than 900 factories, which is about 20% more as compared to the onset of the diplomatic rift. So the installation or the fragmentation of this typical classical production scheme that the GCC used to have is eroding a little bit. We see that Qatar is building up own manufacturing capacity, with over 900 factories, and this is institutionalized or channeled into SMEs. So this is perhaps also summarizing up, thank you, summarizing up some of the facets that we have been discussing today. So to provide a humble prospect or outlook on what can be achieved from a diversification point of view, Qatar has much potential to serve as a hub for humanitarian and diplomatic efforts. So humanitarian efforts, I think it's self-explanatory, and diplomatic efforts, we just see the example of like the Afghanistan. I just need some water, but that's okay. I think I have it here. Sorry. Kindly accept my apologies, please. So with regards to a diplomatic hub, Qatar could well serve as a hub not only for the example of Afghanistan, but also for other regional and international examples, for example. As we have also seen, the Qatar National Vision also places an emphasis on a knowledge-based economy. We've been talking about this yesterday too, so I will just refer to the discussion we had yesterday and what could stem from it. This is mainly one of the suggestions, the humble suggestions that I like to make is that Qatar could become an exporter of knowledge. Rather than importing knowledge as a paradigm, you could at least start exporting knowledge, tell the world that you know something. Because this logistical effort was best practice. So you could start thinking about exporting that knowledge. It's second to none. So tell the world that you've achieved something nice. Tell them why that is. It can be proven. And tell the world how you did it. So at least, if we go back from a point of view from a logistician, export that part of knowledge and start twisting the idea of importing knowledge, this old paradigm, into a challenge and a chance and an opportunity to diversify and say, we start exporting knowledge. We can tell the world how to do logistics. We can tell the world how to run infrastructures from an air wing and a sea wing. And it has been proven as a use case by Qatar. The country has survived magnificently and is prospering despite the diplomatic rift. I know. So, shukran. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much.
يسلموا فرانك. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا. The last speaker of today, he is going to talk. We have Dr. Ayhab Saad. He is going to talk about the effect of the blockade on trade and export diversification in Qatar. The floor is yours. I know that you are tired, and this is going to be the last intervention. I'm going to try to be brief. or maybe not. I have 20 minutes anyway. We're going to give you only 10 minutes because we need 15 minutes for discussion and then to take a group photograph. So I'm going to be brief. I would like to thank the speakers. Dr. Frank and myself are going to tackle the same topic. So I do not need to talk about the Qatar blockade. And I would like to say why diversification? Why do we need diversification? Why do we need such diversification, particularly in terms of trade? Because we all know that the GCC countries have achieved the high levels of growth and also indicators of growth are very high. So I think that the answer comes from this diagram that you can see before you here. So the problematic when it comes to GCC economies, because the model of growth is a bit problematic due to the fluctuations of the prices of oil and gas, and the consumption of per capita in the GCC countries is closely related to oil prices. So the oil prices are the ones that decide the whole process, and this is the problematic. So the diversification process, as we know, let's talk about it as an insurance policy. So we're doing fine, but we have to take into account the fluctuations of oil prices and the situation on the ground. I'm going to talk very briefly. If we're talking about diversification, is there diversification in the GCC? We know. So if we take the state of Qatar as an example, 90% of the state of Qatar's exports rely on natural resources, oil and gas. And in my view, the problematic does not lie in the fact that the exports are only linked to one particular sector. I think that the problem lies in the number of exported goods, and this is what is called the extensive margin of trade, and this is closely linked to what is called the Dutch disease, and we're going to talk at great length why this is constituting a problematic. So the number of merchandise which is problematic. Is there a diversification process in the last 15 to 16 years? Has there been any diversification processes? If we look at this graph, so the shorter the bars, the more diversification there is. If we go to the state of Qatar, for instance, in 2016 is blue and red is 2010. So this is one of the indicators that show diversification in terms of exports. And we notice that most of the GCC countries, the red bars are shorter than the blue bars. This means that there is diversification between 2016 and 2010. This is compared to the level of diversification in other countries. So this shows that there is diversification in terms of exports, but let's be cautious. Most of the progress and the diversification happened prior to 1990. If we put the same figures between to the period prior to that, we're not going to see much more diversification happening in the 2014 onwards. So the diversification was even prior to that. Yes, there is progress, but it is limited progress. Let me talk very quickly, and after that I would like to move to the main theme of this discussion. How can we achieve diversification of the economy and trade? I think in the last 2 days, most papers concentrated on finding an answer to this question. And the literature is going to give us a view about how economies can diversify trade. We talked about human capital. We talked about the quality of institutions. We talked about trade liberalization. We talked about macroeconomics and financial policies. And we talked about all the activities that the state can work on in order to diversify its economy. But modern literature concentrates, and here lies the points of similarity with what Dr. Frank had said, that this is concentrating on global value chain because diversification requires an active participation in the global value chain because the process of production is changing very quickly, particularly in the last 20 years, and there's a fragmentation in this chain, and the structures have changed, and countries have to be effective participants in the value chain procedures. So let's now talk about from this standpoint, we'd like to talk about the importance of the value chain. Although we agreed on its importance for economic diversification, we'd like to see how the blockade impacted the diversification of trade in the state of Qatar. We all know what has happened. We all know the situation in 2017, as Dr. Frank had explained. So overnight, the situation was blocked with 4 countries. Trade was halted overnight. Let's talk about the size of imports. This is a quarter of a year. We find here the second quarter of 2017 when the blockade took place. It is clear that there was a decline in the total imports of the state of Qatar. It is clear that it declined, but in the third or the fourth quarter of 2017, there was a huge rise in imports. And so we have also amended the prices based on the situation. And here in orange, we have the imports as a percentage per GDP. We have seen a small decline, and then there was a rise. So we thought, what had happened? It is clear that there is something there. And maybe we thought that the oil imports that sets the economic growth in the GCC. And this is what has happened in the imports market. We have looked at the imports of the market of Qatar. Yes, there was an increase in exports, sorry, due to the increase of oil exports. So the orange line is the oil exports, and the blue line is the other exports. So perhaps there was an increase in prices and there were more exports. Perhaps that could have been the explanation of the situation. But let's look more meticulously into what has happened to trade between the state of Qatar and the blockading countries. So this was the question that was posed. There was a blockade. Has the trade come to a halt? Yes, the trade has come to a halt, as we had expected. Here we have the trade with the GCC countries. The yellow color is the Emirates. This is the size of trade before the blockade and after the blockade. So the halt was not instantaneous. Some of it happened in the third quarter, particularly with the Emirates and Egypt, but then it went down completely in 2018 to reach a complete halt between the state of Qatar and the GCC countries, or the blockading in particular countries. So let's deepen our understanding of what has happened. What are the goods that Qatar used to import from GCC countries, that it used to rely on the GCC countries? So there are 6 basic goods. So if we take, for instance, copper. If we look here in 2016, in the fourth quarter of 2016, 99% of the state of Qatar's imports from copper was from the blockading countries. If we look at yogurt and dairy products, more than 95% of Qatar's imports of dairy products were from blockading countries. So in my view, and here we go back to what Dr. Frank had said, so what is the question that should be posed? How was Qatar able to overcome the repercussions of the blockade in importing such goods? When we look at the impact, so the impacts should be huge on such kind of goods that Qatar used to import at great length from blockading countries. So we notice as well here, yes, after the blockade, the state of Qatar stopped importing these goods from the blockading countries, and consequently, where does the state of Qatar import its goods from? And this is the exercise that we would like to carry out here. So, for instance, when it comes to electric cables, if we look here, this is the situation before the blockade. Before the blockade, as we said, in excess of 80% of electric cables were from blockading countries, and they used to be important from other countries as well. If we look at the situation after the blockade, and here once again, I would like to go back to the point that was underlined by Dr. Friend, there was more diversification. There is no country that has the upper hand or the majority of import size. So we had, as a result of that, 5 or 4 major sources of these goods. If we look, for instance, yogurt, for instance, as one of the goods, the same thing had happened. All imports of the state of Qatar happened to be from blockading countries, but after the blockade, we have seen a diversification of sources from which the state of Qatar started importing its goods. And this is very important indeed when we talk about the logistical dimension and how the state of Qatar was able to overcome the shock that happened suddenly. If we look at the diversification process, it varies over time. If we look at the third quarter of 2017, because here Qatar didn't have enough time to move towards international markets because it needed to cater for the needs of the local market very quickly. And we have seen most of the imports of the state of Qatar when it comes to yogurt have come from Turkey. And everybody knows the story and the role that was played by Turkey vis-a-vis Qatar and how it started Turkey exporting basic goods to the state of Qatar. But at the same time, Qatar was seeking to have more markets, and this manifested greatly in the third quarter of 2018 and the fourth quarter of 2018, Qatar started using a diverse palette of markets because the state of Qatar was seeking higher value and lower prices. Did this impact and have repercussions on consumers? So let's look at the impact on consumers. Let's look at the unit values of yogurt, for instance. If we look at that in the graph, you will see straight after the blockade, the price of yogurt had increased exponentially. And this, as we have seen, if we look at how the state of Qatar has resorted to Turkey very quickly to import yogurt, for instance, irrespective of the prices. But let's look at the price started declining after the first quarter of 2018, and this was very important. And the decline of prices was due to the diversification of imports depending on the source of the goods. So due to this diversification, the state of Qatar was seeking the best prices and the best goods and services. لقد شارفت على الانتهاء. I would like to conclude by saying, if there is a lesson that we have learned from history, I think that diversification is not easy. It is not easy for countries to diversify their economies away from oil. And in my view, the blockade has given us a very important lesson. The state of Qatar was able in a very short period of time to diversify its economy. And I think this is very important because the diversification of imports means opening new markets. And opening new markets means that there are going to be new trade relations. And in my view, these trade relations, although they are import specific, this is going to help the state of Qatar to export as well, because this is a process whereby the state of Qatar was building new relations and therefore enable it to enter the global value chain and new markets. At the end, I always put this, what about the right incentives? In my view, the state of Qatar and most of the GCC countries have followed the policies that are known when it comes to the diversification of the economy. But some success had been achieved, but it's still limited. And in my view, the main reason lies in the right incentives. And I would like to give an example and then conclude. Yes, human capital is very important, and we do need human capital. But the importance of human capital emanates from what? When we have men and women, and particularly women who are educated women, are much more capability to take initiatives to open institutions, companies. They are proactive in innovation. And we know that we need such kind of thing. And the risk-taking behavior is also very important. So capital is linked to such initiatives. I think that the GCC, they do not have, it is not that they do not have capital, but they do not have the incentive that would make men and women resort to such activities that have high income. So that is why they resort to the public sector, because it is much more secure and with more return. That is why incentives should be the right incentives for the economic activities to start. And here, if we talk about policy recommendations, I would like to talk about job markets and also the policies of migration. These or immigration policies, these two sectors, they need reforms for the diversification of the economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you to our speakers in this session. I have many questions personally, but I want to leave them aside and open the floor, please. And do not take more than 1 minute to make comments. Make your questions, make them pointed, because we don't have much time. We at best have 20 minutes. Thank you very much. I have many points, but I'll make them slow for the sake of translation. The papers were distinguished that Qatar Strategy 2030 has changed completely as a result of the blockade. This is my personal opinion. Now we don't know in which direction the country is heading. We have the blockade, then the World Cup. Qatar, after these two events, is not the Qatar that we know. We hope to see more papers clarifying these matters. As for the supply chain, yes, we saw uh, a very noticeable success. I think Qatar has benefited a great deal from the blockade, but we have not seen any papers because we look at the things from a political point of view and not a pragmatic point of view. I agree with Frank that Qatar can export knowledge like many other governments. Um, and the final paper was very distinguishable because it contained some of the lessons I'm after, and it has talked about economic diversification, which is suitable for Qatar because it varies from one country to another. Sebastian, Mohammad Abu Zaid. Thank you very much. My question was on the importation that Dr. Ayhab, the presentation was very nice and very useful, but what about, you talked about import diversification, which was followed in Qatar, This leaves no room for doubt. It was very clear that in the export. What about the import substitution policy? Now I see more products produced in Qatar. This is a distinguishable thing. What about the import substitution policy, which matters much more for the concept of diversification? In the same context, there is an important indicator in diversification when it comes to the imports and exports. The Gulf countries still suffer from a weakness in the linkages between supply chains, whether at the local or international level, and it's important to raise the standards to achieve the economic diversification. Dr. Bashar, thank you to our colleagues for their presentations. لدي سؤالان. السؤال الأول موجه للدكتور فرانك. شكرا لك على هذا.
The economists refer to logistic on a macro level, but we don't know what's going deep inside. So thank you. My question is, Dr. Frank, as a logistician, how we could classify the logistic sector? If you know that logistics sector is deemed to be one of the diversifications sectors in most of Gulf visions and strategic long-term plans. So how we could classify this sector? Is it a dependent sector or independent, a follower sector? I'm a little bit confused because I think improving in production and manufacturing could boost the logistics sectors. So how we could classify it? Is it an independent or dependent or follower? Thank you. My second question to Dr. Ayhab, you refer to export diversification. What do you mean by export diversification as an index? It is number of exports or non-oil to oil exports, and in your opinion, what is the best indicator for this index as well? Thank you.
We take two more questions from this side. Thank you for these lectures, very thorough indeed. My question to Dr. Ayhab, you are an expert in the theory of commerce and division of labor. Why not? There are specialities in this. You said that there are political limits which hinder the movement of people. There is also a problem of security with the fluctuation of the prices of the goods, but the Gulf countries have managed to smooth the standard of living from one year to another through the sovereign funds. Yesterday they were told they do not suffer from the Dutch disease at all. So therefore, the question is, what is the reason? There is no reason whatsoever to diversification, although this is the title of this conference, and this is a question to everybody. If there are sovereign funds, then countries on the business cycle can smooth it. I don't know, but this conference is organized under the title of economic diversification. Thank you very much. My name is Osama Saadi from Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. When there were many lessons that can be learned from the blockade, we saw how Qatar imported cows in order to produce dairy products, and they have excelled. We are self-sufficient now, and we even export 1.6% of the dairy products we have now. Also, another point I would like to make, and that is to do with the legislation to encourage investment, real estate property ownership by 100%. We need also legislation today if an investment comes to open a new restaurant, a small restaurant, he wants to bring, for example, some workers, they're not allowed. For example, if I want to have a Syrian restaurant, I'm only allowed 2 Indian workers or something who have no idea about the Syrian food. So the laws should be more flexible in Qatar to encourage investment. Okay, let's start with the answers now.
Question, I really appreciate it. The question was on as to whether logistics is a dependent or an independent function. And I'd like to say it's both. It's probably the best answer, it's both, but I'll explain why it is both. It is independent because especially in air transportation and in air logistics capacity, you try to link to markets away from your own home market so you can profit from the growth internationally. So as an airline, when you fly to markets internationally, you seek markets that have the highest growth, perhaps in passenger revenue and passenger traffic. So as an airline, you can fill your aircraft, regardless if it's national flying or international flying, you will fill your aircraft. So you keep aircraft flying to wherever global growth markets are. So in this way, logistics is an independent function of whatever happens locally. You keep your aircraft flying from HIA internationally to wherever they go, and they will capture the passengers, and they will capture the revenue. So in that sense, it's independent. It becomes a dependent function once you have a local manufacturing situation. And if I am allowed, I'd like to connect those both questions. For example, in the case of milk, it becomes a dependent function because with milk, especially here in Qatar, the problem is, you mentioned the Baladna cows. The cows give milk every day. And they produce the milk every day. And you have to use the milk every day. But because of the demography of Qatar, most of the expats leave Qatar in the summer. So you don't have the demand. We were talking, Dr. Ahata was mentioning yesterday, we need to look at supply and demand. It needs to be balanced. So while we have cows that deliver milk every day, even in June, July, August, we don't have the expats that consume the product because they go home. So you need a solution for this. You need what we call in supply chain milk bumpers. And one of those milk bumpers is when logistics becomes a dependent function, whereby you try to find export ways, and then it is a dependent function. So as a short answer to that question, if I may. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. دكتور فريد تحب تعلق على أي شيء أو تعليق؟
بالنسبة للسؤال الخاص بالاستراتيجية
طبعا when we worked on the strategy it was 2017, but with the blockade this was postponed to 2018. So therefore, so far as the blockade is concerned, but so far as the World Cup is concerned, I agree with you. There are priorities, and priorities can change while implementing the strategy. As for the legislation, this is what we call the basic ground upon which many of the economic diversification can be built. We need incentives, we need resilience, we need flexibility. Without that, we will face a lot of problems. We see many countries facing problems in that, but some governments manage to facilitate things. As for the experts, we need to expand experts. We really need to restructure exports, and we expand the number of products, the markets. The exportable products should be increased to achieve competitiveness, and I must also focus on the number of targeted markets. This will minimize the risks too. Thank you, Dr. Ayhab. Thank you for all these questions. I'll start with Dr. Bashar's question about export diversification index. This is a very complex issue. Until now, the literature does not agree on one indicator index because this is a very sensitive issue, very sensitive index. For example, do you consider all dairy products one products, or should milk and yogurt be two different products? So there is a lot of debate, and to have an index to measure that is a complex issue, and the definition still needs to be worked on. As for Dr. Mohammad, 100% import substitute policy. I worked for my paper with Hanan. She is a developmental economist of one of our students at the institute. We still are looking for suitable data. We don't have production data at the level of goods. We need some data on more accurate data. We are playing some tricks now to learn what can be done at the local level, but we haven't got yet the necessary data to complete our work. This is our target. We don't want to stop here. We want to continue the work. And also, Dr. Elias, frankly speaking, if I had more time, I would have said more about this subject, because I too posed this question as a trade economist. Even at the level of undergraduation, there should be a specialization. This is how you achieve profit. People focus on that to benefit from the advantage of competitiveness. I think this subject, I'm still with the specialization as a principle, but as I said, some Gulf countries used to, now they want to focus on knowledge production. If we do that, will we have a conference entitled Economic Diversification? In that case, we really need more specialization. There is projection that the natural resources will be depleted, so there is the question of sustainability. This is an important issue, and how can we build economic activities which would enable us to move away from oil and gas products is not just a question of depletion of resources, but the world is moving in the direction of alternative sources of energy. So the number, there's no problem with specialization here, that 50-60% can be focusing on a certain goods or products. But the problem, when the total number of exported goods is little, this means that one or two sectors will be dominating the market, and if anything happens and the demand is reduced, then you'll have no alternatives at hand. So therefore, it's important, in my opinion, to be aware of that. Mr. Osama, about legislation conducive to investment, this is probably one of the things that I talk most about. We really need some restructuring, revisiting when it comes to legislation on investment. Sorry. Definitely, this is the entry point when it comes to export division. The data on goods, we don't have the details. We also look forward for more data at the level of institutions, and this would help us to identify the goods that we can expand more and to be the launching pad for experts. We're waiting for the data, and that maybe next year, and next year's conference, we'll have more data. Thank you very much, Dr. Ayhab. I think you took more time, I think. I don't know whether we have any more time or not. We can't hear the speaker without a microphone. This is just a result. We lost the speaker again. Thank you very much, Dr. Bashar. Now I invite Dr. Haider to wrap up and to give us the closing remarks, and my colleague, the regional representative for the Gulf States program, ليأتوا إلى المنصة فقط لمدة 5 دقائق. شكرا جزيلا. سأكون مختصرا في الكلام. أولا أود أن أشكر كل المتحدثين والمساهمين.
Today, I think we once more got aware that of course there are challenges when it comes to economic diversification in the Gulf states, but there are also a lot of opportunities, and also a lot of things are already going on, and especially when it comes, for example, to SMEs, to the private sector, and to women and youth participation in the workforce. These are all topics that we as Adenauer Foundation, and especially as a regional program Gulf States, will continue to work on. And we also will, with the help of the Arab Center, I hope and guess, be able to continue to work on this topic and to continue to deliver these kinds of dialogue platforms as we had them yesterday and today. Thank you very much, and thank you especially very much, Dr. Haider.
Thank you, Fabian. أنا أيضا بدوري
I too want to thank all the presenters who presented these papers over the last 2 days. They may be leaving us today or tomorrow, but they are always welcome here in Doha and welcome to our institute. And I thank all the chairpersons, Fabian, Dr. Marwan, Dr. Mohammad Yaghi, Dr. Sahar, and I would like to thank the unknown soldiers who are my colleagues from the Arab Center who organized the social media, the IT side. This is their product more than it's ours. Our thanks go to them. And apart from what Fabian has talked about, and collaboration with Adinor, we will prepare these papers to be published in a book which will be an addition to the literature. And if those of you who sent us their papers and want to finalize the papers and send them, we will receive them all, we will peer review them, and we hope that there were some very nice papers, and this the book will be published in Arabic. We publish a periodical journal called Al-Multaqa. It's on JSTOR as a PDF document, and we select the distinguished papers which are published by our center. وقد maybe 4 or 5 papers will be selected, and also in collaboration with our colleague we can choose from our journal entitled Hikama, apart from them. So therefore the next step is to select these papers and publish them through more than one means. Finally, I thank you all for taking part, and we hope that we will meet you in more